Hello everyone, welcome to the CEG-MUDE week of machine learning. In this lecture, we are going to learn about unsupervised learning. What is unsupervised learning? How is it different from supervised learning? What do we use unsupervised learning for? We will find out the answers together in this lecture. As learning objectives, by the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain the concept of unsupervised learning and its differences from supervised learning and define latent variable models in discrete and continuous forms. Latent variables are a new concept that will be introduced in this lecture. There are two topics in this lecture. The first one is Introduction to Unsupervised Learning. The second is latent variables models that are commonly used in unsupervised learning. First, let's find out the answers to the questions, what is unsupervised learning and how is it different from supervised learning? In previous lectures, you learned about supervised learning that involves regression and classification. Here, we will define unsupervised learning by comparing it with supervised learning. In supervised learning, we have a set of input data X and a corresponding set of target data T, and find a function x that approximates T. In a discriminative setting, supervised learning models the relationship between x and t by approximating T with a function f of x. In a probabilistic setting, the goal of supervised learning is to predict the conditional probability of T when x is observed. In other words, given the observation x, what is the probability of observing a corresponding target T? Also, supervised learning can be divided into classification problems and regression problems corresponding to discrete and continuous formulation of the problem. Compared with supervised learning, unsupervised learning only has the input data X without the target. Using the input data, unsupervised learning can find the probability distribution of X, which is what we call density estimation. Or unsupervised learning can discover a latent variable denoted by set and predict the conditional probability between the latent variable set and the input data X. We will concretely define latent variable later. By introducing latent variables, unsupervised learning can perform clustering and dimensionality reduction, which corresponds to the discrete and continuous formulation of the problem, respectively. Let's see an example of the differences between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. We have a set of two-dimensional input data. The first dimension is the length of an animal, and the second dimension is the height of an animal. Here we plot the same data samples for both supervised and unsupervised learning. The difference is, for supervised learning, we have a target or label for the data samples. In the left figure, you can see the target of cats and dogs denoted by crosses and circles. For unsupervised learning, in the right figure, there is only the observed input data without any target. This shows us the difference in data between supervised and unsupervised learning. Using the input data and target data, supervised learning finds a function or conditional probability distribution that can distinguish between cats and dogs from the input data. Since this problem is discrete, we also call this a classification problem between cats and dogs. This problem is supervised because we know which data samples are from cats and which are from dogs. For unsupervised learning, since there is no target data, unsupervised learning finds two clusters in the input data that potentially indicate two types of animals, as indicated by the two circles. The two types of animal are the latent variables discovered by this clustering problem. This problem is unsupervised because we don't know which animal types the data samples are from. When having a new input data sample for the supervised classification problem, we will be able to know if the data sample belongs to cats and dogs, or the probability of belonging to cats and dogs. When having a new data sample for the unsupervised clustering problem, we will be able to know which one of the two clusters the data sample belongs to, or the probability of such belonging. But we will not be able to tell if the data sample is from cats or dogs. So this shows us the difference in terms of goals and usage between supervised and unsupervised learning. Before we dig into clustering and dimensionality reduction problems in unsupervised learning, let's briefly find out what is density estimation that can be done purely based on the input data without introducing a latent variable. Given a data set of X, density estimation can discover the probability P of X. Here is an example with a one-dimensional dataset. We plot the histogram of the dataset using blue bars. The x-axis is the data value and the y-axis is the number of data samples with the same value. By doing so, we can see that the distribution of the data values follows a typical normal distribution or Gaussian distribution. Therefore, by fitting into a Gaussian distribution, we can have the probability distribution of X and the probability of a new data sample belonging to the input data. Of course, in reality, we need to work on high dimensional data where we will have a mixture of probability distributions across the different dimensions. Next, let's find out what is the latent variable models and what are clustering and dimensionality reduction. We introduced latent variables denoted by set in clustering and dimensionality reduction problems. These variables are also known as hidden variables and unobserved variables. They are not directly observable like the input data, but they influence how a data sample X is observed. This means knowing the latent variable set will affect the probability of observing X. In this way, we can have a marginal distribution of X by summing the joint distribution over all possible states of the latent variable set. This equation here defines how the marginal distribution of X is obtained with the introduction of the latent variable set. So let's visualize this definition of latent variable models using the same example data of animal length and height. For this data set, the latent variable set is the type of animals. We identify two states for set, which we can call animal 1 and animal 2. Using the input data, we can estimate the conditional probability of X when the latent variable set is an animal 1 and animal 2 based on the two clusters we found. Then we can obtain the marginal distribution of X by summing the joint distribution over the two possible states of set, which are animal 1 and animal 2. This is how we include the latent variables in an unsupervised learning problem and how a latent variable can affect the observation of X. So far, we have been discussing latent variable models in a discrete form using the animal dataset. This discrete formulation of latent variable models represents the problem of clustering in unsupervised learning. In the continuous form, latent variable models, we use integration instead of summation. This continuous formation represents the problem of dimensionality reduction, in which we reduce the dimension number of the input data to a smaller number. The main purpose of latent variable models is to model complex marginal distributions over observed data, with more tractable joint distributions over latent variable set. So we can see the introduction of latent variables as a way to simplify how we observe our complex datasets. Here are two simple examples of clustering and dimensionality reduction. For both examples, remember we only have the data samples as input. In the left figure, we have a two-dimensional dataset for a typical clustering problem. Here we can identify 3 clusters from the input dataset, indicated by different colors. In the right figure, we also have a two-dimensional dataset. Here we can reduce the dimensionality of the dataset to 1. Meaning that we can define a one-dimensional line indicated by the dashed line to represent the two-dimensional data. So let's see an example with a real-life dataset. The iris flower dataset is a well-known dataset in machine learning. It has 4 observed data types which are the petal length and the width, and the sepal length and width. 3 iris specifiers are included in this data set, namely Virginica, Versicolor, and Setosa. We can perform clustering of the 4-dimensional data set. In the left figure, we figure out the 3 clusters from clustering, which matches the actual 3 species of iris flowers. Note that we only show the 3D data here, but the actual data set is 4D. We can also perform dimensionality reduction on the 4-dimensional data set. The figure on the right shows a 2-dimensional data set obtained from the 4-dimensional data set by dimensionality reduction. In this way, we try to preserve the main characteristics of the 4D data so that the 3 iris species are still recognizable from the lower dimensional data set. In this lecture, we learned that unsupervised learning is learning probability distributions over observed data without a target data. It mainly includes 3 applications, namely density estimation, clustering, and dimensionality reduction. In unsupervised learning, we introduce latent variables that are unobserved variables used to learn more tractable joint distributions of observed data. Discrete and continuous latent variable models will represent clustering problems and dimensionality reduction problems, respectively. Now we are at the end of this lecture, and hopefully you can now explain the concept of unsupervised learning and its differences from supervised learning. You can also define latent variables models in discrete and continuous form. And here are some reading materials that can also help you to understand the content of this lecture. Thank you for your attention.